Hi everyone, my name is Shahane De Silva and I'm a researcher here at the Center for Policy Alternatives, here with our founder executive director Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu to discuss a recently published policy brief on Sri Lanka's crisis of governance. Any opening remarks before we begin, Doctor?
Well, yes, I mean, the crisis, the Aragalaya and all of that has been seen as being largely a consequence of economic mismanagement. But I think the point that needs to be made is that economics is the sort of practical area in which it operates, but it's mismanagement that is the overarching issue. So that's why the first question that I want to ask you is, how do you characterize this crisis as a crisis of governance?
We characterize the economic crisis as a crisis of governance by looking at a number of cases that depict issues of governance that have led to economic devastation and then resulted in the economic crisis, right? Culminating in the economic crisis. And this goes from the executive presidency and its impact on economic decision making, tax policy and revenue administration. We have public procurement, and of course anti-corruption and corruption vulnerabilities, among other issues. And the ultimate point to really summarize it is that at a time of slow economic growth, complex tax policy, weak revenue administration, coupled with debt-fueled, excessive and wasteful government expenditure really created the conditions for national insolvency and weak institutional checks and balances, especially on the office of executive president, failed to constrain arbitrary decision making. So we see that the economic crisis really has its roots in these deep-rooted governance issues.
So how do you think the abolition of the executive presidency will prevent such mismanagement from happening in the future?
So the idea of the executive presidency was to create the space for decisive action for rapid economic development. But in reality, what we find is that it has created greater space for opaque, incompetent, and even corrupt economic decision making. And if we abolish the executive presidency, we then move to a parliamentary system of democracy that is typified by collaboration in decision making that limits some of the, to put it in a very crude way, the stupidity we've seen in economic decision making. Take November 2019, for example, where then President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's tax policy greatly reduced tax revenue. And this one decision led to the IMF program that we were in being suspended. Sri Lanka's credit ratings were downgraded, where we were locked out of international financial markets and couldn't borrow through international sovereign bonds. And of course, we had to rely on heavy borrowings from local commercial banks and the central bank to tide us over until we just couldn't do that anymore. Not to mention his decision to ban chemical fertilizer overnight, triggering a food crisis, reducing foreign currency inflows because of reduced agricultural productivity as well, among other decisions.
So you think return to a more parliamentary system will put greater constraints and checks and balances on him, and this kind of mismanagement can be averted?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Now, how are the ways in which government expenditure can be curbed?
The first starting point is the public sector. I think one way of putting it, if I was to summarize it in one sentence, we can do more with less. So if we were to think about the public sector, we have a public sector where in 2023, 15% of the total workforce was employed in the public sector. This is the highest in South Asia and Southeast Asia. There is a public sector employee for every 16 people in Sri Lanka. If you compare that to Pakistan and Sri Lanka, there is one public sector employee for more than 100 persons, right? And public sector salaries account for a third of government revenue. So the public sector is massive and it costs a lot. And the public sector is notorious for inefficient public service delivery. So what we need to do is scale back, reduce the public sector greatly, right size it for each ministry, really find the required amount for each ministry, attract the right talent into the public sector, and do more with less.
How do we retrench those who are there? I mean, do we need to come up with training programs, reskilling them, or do we just get rid of them?
We can't just get rid of them.
Exactly.
Of course, the government has an onus to take care of all of these public sector employees, and they are breadwinners for their families. If we take, for example, the case of defense, the military, right? Again, way too many personnel. But what we can do is we can have the government spend on vocational training, reskilling these people for where there are deficiencies in the economy, right? Let's take construction and tourism, for example. We can reskill them and divert them to those sectors. So, there are different ways of going about it. Vocational training and moving them to those sectors is one way of going about it. But of course, the state can't just send people home, but it would be cheaper and more efficient in the long run to foot the bill for this kind of vocational training than retain this public sector that is notoriously inefficient.
All right, what about state-owned enterprises? I mean, what should the government do with regard to them? They're running at tremendous losses. And how should the state actually engage in the market? Should the state engage with the market?
State-owned enterprises, I mean, the government has proven incapable of managing businesses for the most part. If we take Sri Lankan Airlines, for example, that's just one example of a badly run SOA. In its final year of private management with the Emirates partnership, it managed a profit of around 9 billion rupees. In the next 7 years, when it became fully publicly owned, we ran into losses in the hundreds of billions, despite the benefit of low fuel prices and increased tourism after the war, right? That's just one example.
Okay.
Ceylon Petroleum Corporation is another, and there are plenty more. The point is that the state needs to have a rationale for how it engages with the market. If the state was to involve itself in natural monopolies like railways, where it doesn't make sense having multiple railway companies in one country, that is totally fair. But it can't involve itself in the market like it is currently doing in competitive industries like hotels, retail, etc. There, the state needs to make a complete withdrawal and allow the private sector to manage those markets, to run those markets. What this will do, because we'll be privatizing these enterprises, is that the proceeds from privatization will go towards paying off our debt, meaning that debt becomes more sustainable. And then, of course, the country benefits from the improved economic growth of these enterprises doing much better under private management.
So they should be entirely privatized. We're not here talking about public-private partnerships.
Public-private partnerships are also an option on the table. That's also fair enough. There are public-private partnerships that worked in the past. It's either that or privatization. But we can't continue to have these enterprises fully government-owned and managed by the government.
So the majority of shares, you would say, should probably be with the private sector rather than with the government. Okay. Now, that brings up also the question of corruption. It's been a big issue in the elections. The government is calling various people, the police, the CID are summoning people to come and give evidence on a number of cases. What can the government actually do? There are arguments that, look, in other countries, now Duterte has just been arrested in the Philippines for the ICC charge. What are the most efficacious, efficient ways of dealing with this? And what are the dangers, if you like, of going outside the judicial process, the established judicial process, to do something about corruption?
I think the solution already exists. It's a matter of reformulating the entities we already have. Now,
Okay.
CBOC, that is the Commission to Investigate Allegations of Bribery and Corruption, can work very well in this regard. But the problem is that we see a high number of case withdrawals.
Okay.
We also have heard that there is a reluctance to pursue cases against senior government officials. Now, this indicates some sort of political exposure, right? And one way in which that might be happening is the Constitutional Council.
Okay.
Now, the Constitutional Council, under the 21st Amendment, currently has 7 members of Parliament and 3 eminent persons. These are non-political figures from various sectors of society. Now, that means that the Constitutional Council, by its nature, is politicized. It's not completely insulated from politics because it has 7 members of Parliament. We need to have a majority of the Constitutional Council, if not all of them, maybe except for the Speaker of Parliament, be eminent persons who are not part of the political establishment. And this will naturally depoliticize all the independent commissions, including CBOC. And we may see a significant improvement on the issues that CBOC currently has. The other aspect is, of course, the Attorney General's Department. Now, CBOC requests prosecutorial assistance from the Attorney General's Department. But we also know that the Attorney General's Department suffers from its own conflicts of interest, right? Between providing legal advice to the government, representing it legally in case of prosecution, but also being the chief public prosecutor of the island, right? These multiple roles conflict, and therefore it can't provide proper prosecutorial assistance to CBOC. This makes the call for an independent public prosecutor's office even stronger, and that's something we need to do. And I think those are 2 starting points for improving anti-corruption and addressing corruption vulnerabilities.
Okay, now we've talked about the executive presidency, we've talked about the problems of governance, we've talked about state-owned enterprises, the public service, and we finally come to corruption. Now, if you were asked to advise the government in terms of 3 priorities in this area, what would they be?
With regard to the economy?
With regard to the economy, with regard to the crisis of governance that you have written about in the brief.
Of course, we know, especially coming off the Budget 2025 speech, that the government has very little maneuvering room, right? We have certain requirements set by the IMF and local legislation where, fiscal balance can't go beyond a certain point, and various other aspects that we need to stay within. Essentially, the government has very little wiggle room. The way that it can give itself more space is to reduce unnecessary expenditure as much as possible. And in that sense, I think the public sector, right-sizing the public sector and divesting through privatization of SOEs is incredibly important. Not only does it allow for a lot of proceeds going from this to go towards debt sustainability, but it also means that the country improves or benefits from the improved economic growth because these enterprises are better managed, right? And also the public sector just becomes more efficient because it is right-sized and you're attracting talent. Even to attract talent, you need to pay competitive wages, and it's easy to pay competitive wages when you have less people, so more resources for a few people. So I think those 2 are incredibly important priorities for this government. They really need to reconsider their positions on these 2 aspects. And then, of course, is minimizing leakages wherever possible, and that requires tackling corruption. Those are the main priorities I think this government needs to really consider in order to give itself a bit more breathing room in order to act.
All right. With regard to the public service, now I'm going to make the assumption that out of those 1.4 million people, the majority of them voted for the NPP-JVP government. So if the government is going to retrench the public service, it's going to have to move, in effect, against its own constituency to a certain extent. How should the government do that?
I think communication is really important in this regard. The government and needs to make it very clear to the entire citizenry that we are in a very tough moment in Sri Lanka's history, particularly its economic history. And for that, there are tough reforms that need to take place. And we can't continue to maintain this public sector and sort of maintain people from womb to tomb, right? Where you have free education and then a job in the public sector. The government can redirect these people through training into sectors where they're badly needed, but we can't continue the public sector in its current form, and they need to communicate that, however difficult it is. The other thing I would like to stress is that timing is really important when it comes to tough reforms. The government needs to move on these really tough reforms at the start of its term. Waiting until, closer to the end of its term when it has to gear up for elections again is strategically not a viable option, right? So it needs to do these tough reforms at the start, communicate the need for these tough reforms the way previous governments have. I mean, certain governments have, for example, with regard to the partnership with Japan with regard to SLT. Famously, former Minister Mangala Samaravira stated that, why should anyone wait, a year and a half for a telephone line, right? So there are ways in which these reforms can be communicated, and we need to sort of take the citizenry on board and really appeal to their civic duty in regard to getting Sri Lanka out of this moment of crisis, because we're not out of the woods yet, even though we're not in petrol queues.
How long will you give them
in order to implement these reforms? Well, a max the first half of their term. I mean, once the second half of their term comes, they're going to have to really think about debt repayment in 2028, and that is going to take the forefront, and of course gearing up for the next round of elections, because obviously they will seek a second term, right? So really the first half of their term is their critical window for the really tough reforms, including some of these really core governance reforms for coming out of national insolvency, or at least making debt more sustainable.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.